For today and for 2 Sundays in August, I'd like to look at a psalm. And sometimes psalms can be a little bit difficult to get your hands around because it's not a narrative. It's not telling a story from point A to point B to point C. And there's multiple writers of psalms. But what I appreciate about a couple of the psalms is they're given the life context of the author. And the author of the psalms we're going to be looking at are written by David. So if you have your Bible, turn to Psalms 59. And when I came to church, when I met Owen, and I mentioned, is it okay to preach out of the New American Standard Version? And I think those are the Bibles that are there on your chair, so I feel right at home here. And Timberley, I don't know if you know, is actually part of the Evangelical Free Church. And after I left camping, I worked for the Evangelical Free Church as an interim pastor. And then from there I moved to an associate pastor and then an executive pastor. So that was the second part of my career, was actually working in churches. But Psalms 59. David, who writes the Psalms, is one of my heroes. It's not just because he did the unimaginable, slaying a giant Goliath, but because of what he is known for by God, a man after God's own heart. In his writings, that heart is revealed. Sometimes it's a heart in turmoil, and sometimes it's a heart in unrest. Sometimes it's a fearful heart. But mostly as David writes and as he reveals his heart, it's a heart desperately seeking and needing God. You see a man who can be in utter despair in the bottom of a pit, whether it's emotionally or spiritually or maybe even physically, one moment, but rejoicing in worship the next. And God uses David to speak to the need of my heart. And when I find myself in a pit, I can still worship. And God has not changed no matter what my circumstances are. So I'd like to read Psalms 59. It says, "Deliver me from my enemies, O my God. Set me securely on high, away from those who rise up against me. Deliver me from those who do iniquity, and save me from the men of bloodshed. For behold, they have set an ambush for my life. Fierce men launch an attack against me. Not for my transgressions, nor for my sin, O Lord, for no guilt of mine. They run, they set themselves against me. Arouse thyself to help me, and see. And thou, O Lord, God of hosts, the God of Israel, awake to punish all the nations. Do not be gracious to any who are treacherous in iniquity. They return at evening, they howl like a dog, and go around the city. Behold, they belch forth with their mouths. Swords are in their lips, for they say, Who hears? But thou, O Lord, dost laugh at them. Thou dost scoff at all the nations. Because of his strength I will watch for thee, for God is my stronghold. My God in his loving kindness will meet me. God will let me look triumphantly upon my foes. Do not slay them, lest my people forget. Scatter them by thy power, and bring them down, O Lord, our shield. On account of the sin of their mouth and the words of their lips, let them even be caught in their pride, and on account of curses and lies which they utter. Destroy them in wrath. Destroy them, that they may be no more, that men may know that God rules in Jacob, to the ends of the earth. And they return at evening, they howl like a dog, and go around the city. They wander about for food, and growl if they are not satisfied. But as for me, I shall sing of thy strength. Yes, I shall joyfully sing of thy loving kindness in the morning. For thou hast been my stronghold and a refuge in the day of my distress. O my strength, I will sing praises to thee. For God is my stronghold, the God who shows me loving kindness. This is a psalm where David feels forgotten. Have you ever felt forgotten? I remember as a kid feeling forgotten. We were living in Wisconsin Rapids at the time and attending a church. And one Sunday, the youth group, I think I was in 5th or 6th grade, met at the church, and we loaded into a couple of vehicles, and we were going on an outing of some sort. I don't remember what the outing was. But just before we were about to leave, the leader asked me to go back into church and get something that he forgot. Now, why did he ask me? I don't know. But when I went into the church and I looked for what he wanted, and when I came back out, they were gone. They had left without me. And maybe that's why he chose me. He didn't want me to go along on the outing. But I went in to retrieve it, and there I was. What was I going to do? This was before the time of cell phones. So I sat down on the step outside the church and felt forgotten. I remember as a young adult feeling forgotten. After graduating from college, I lived at home with my parents for a year to work to save money to go to seminary. And my parents were living in Minneapolis at the time. So when the day came for me to leave to go to California, I loaded my meager belongings into my 1965 Chevy Impala Super Sport with baby moon hubcaps and air shocks. And that car rode like this down the road. And I got in that car and I drove all the way to California, not knowing if that car was going to make it. But in essence, I got there without a plan. All I knew was I was supposed to be at school on a Tuesday for a new student retreat. And when I arrived on a Sunday. And I knew nothing other than to go to this school. So I went to this school hoping to find somebody to talk to. But it was a Sunday. When I got there, the buildings, the offices were closed. So I had no option other than I went driving down the road trying to find a motel to stay in. And I found this cheap motel. And as I bring my stuff into the room, I sit on the edge of the bed, and there's a mirror. And as I look in the mirror, I'm looking at myself, crying, saying, God, what is happening here? Why did you bring me here? Where are you? I felt forgotten. Well, Psalms 59 is the response of David during a time when he feels forgotten. God seems to be sleeping, and he calls out for him to be aroused, to wake up, to see what is happening to him. Well, what is happening to him? That's where Psalms 59 is put in life context. At the heading of the psalm, it says this. It says, it's the Psalm of David. When Saul sent men, and they watched the house in order to kill him. This is a psalm where David men are coming to kill him. Well, let's just read this account in 1 Samuel, just a couple verses. 1 Samuel 19 gives the life context for this. And it says this in verse 11 in Psalms 19, and Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him in order to put him to death in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be put to death. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went out and fled and escaped. And Michal took the household idol and laid it on the bed and put a quilt of goat's hair at its head and covered it with clothes. And when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said to him, he is sick. Then Saul sent messengers to see David, saying, bring him up to me on his bed, that I may put him to death. And when the messengers entered, behold, the household idol was on the bed, with the quilt of goat's hair at its head. So Saul said to Michal, Why have you deceived me like this, and let my enemy go, so that he has escaped? Michal said to Saul, he said to me, let me go. Why should I put you to death? I think she was kind of making up a story there. Now David fled and escaped and came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and stayed in Naioth. Saul had had enough of David. David had won the heart of his son Jonathan. David was married to his daughter. David was a victorious military leader and was winning the hearts of the people and Saul's family. David was a victorious military leader, and David had been anointed as the next king of Israel. With David alive, Saul's days as king were numbered. David was an enemy, and the enemy needed to be eliminated. And Saul had tried more than once to do it himself with a spear, but was unsuccessful. Remember, David would play the harp for Saul, and Saul would take a spear and try and kill him. But now Saul had a new plan. He would have men watch David's house and wait in order to put him to death in the morning. Saul had either told his daughter about these plans, or maybe most likely Saul had told Jonathan, because he told Jonathan everything. And Jonathan told his sister Michal. And David flees from the home. And it's in that context that David writes Psalms 59. In the midst of this circumstances, he writes Psalms 59. David records two things. He records a prayer, and he records a song. Let's look at the prayer. As David prays, he prays for two things. And I think these are things that you can pray for, that I can pray for, that we can pray for. So what's the first thing that he prays? He prays for God to act on his behalf. He was in a dire situation. He needed God to act. And this is what he asked God to do. First he says, deliver me. 13 times. 13 times. In verses 1 through 4, David uses a personal pronoun. David is praying for himself. Twice David asked God to deliver him. Verse 1, deliver me from my enemies. Verse 2, deliver me from those who do iniquity. He is asking God to do what he cannot do on his own. Unless God intervenes, his fate is sealed. David had seen God's deliverance in the past from lions and bears and giants. But in those situations, David had a role. David could wield a sling and a stone with 100% accuracy. The giant was completely overmatched by David. He didn't stand a chance with David. But David now needs deliverance from the plot and schemes of Saul, where David does not have a role. His sling and his sword will not save him. So he pleads for God to deliver him. He cannot deliver himself. Deliver me, he prays. Deliver me from my enemies. These are not good people. He will spend a good part of this psalm describing them. They are fierce men. They are scheming men. They are like dogs wandering in a city looking for food. They are sinners. They are evil. They will not stop. They have been commissioned by the king to do one thing: to kill David. They're not coming over to David's house for a potluck. David says, deliver me from my enemies, oh my God. David goes to the only place he can. He goes to his God. And David can ask because he knows God personally. My God, David says, not someone else's. but my God. He knows him personally. He has seen God work in his life. David is searching for God, though. He is questioning God, though. God is real and personal to him, but he needs to find God. God Jehovah is his God, and he is seeking him. Well, he prays that God would set him. He says, set me, again, the personal pronoun, set me securely on high. He wants to be in a place where they cannot touch him, a place where only God can put him, a place of security, a place of protection, a place of only God's doing. We all long for that, don't we? We want to know that we have not been forgotten. The Apostle Paul had that same experience. He was in a similar situation in 2 Timothy 4, verses 17 and 18. And Paul writes this in 2 Timothy, "But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me in order that through me the proclamation might be fully accomplished, and that all the Gentiles might hear. And I was delivered out of the lion's mouth. The Lord will deliver me from every evil deed, and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen." Paul says first that he was delivered out of the lion's mouth. David had been delivered out of the lion's mouth. And then secondly, that the Lord will deliver him from every evil deed and bring him safely to his heavenly kingdom. The security on high. That's what David was praying. The same thing that Paul was praying. I think David, like Paul, knew that even if God chose not to stop his enemies, God would bring him to his heavenly kingdom, secure, safe on high, forever and ever. There's a present and a future aspect to God's deliverance. If he chooses to deliver you and I from something today, that is his grace. But it will not compare to where he will deliver his children someday, his heavenly kingdom forever and ever, secure on high. And that's where David is praying and pleading for God, that even in the midst, if his enemies are successful, that God would deliver him on high. When you feel forgotten, look down the road. Look down the road and realize that God's deliverance may not be for a specific thing, but it will be for eternity. And he prays that he would be delivered, that he would be set securely on high from those who rise up against him. David knows that he is their target, their purpose for what they are attempting to do. They are motivated and will not stop until they are successful. They are rising up, and he wants God to rise up even higher. He wants, then he says, to deliver me from those who do iniquity. What they want to do is contrary to God's purpose as David understands it. They are acting on their own behalf, on the behalf of Saul. What they want to do is sinful. There's no reason for them to do this. David has not committed a sin warranting this to occur. He is innocent related to anything related to Saul. He has done nothing to usurp Saul's kingship. He has loved Saul and protected him and served him. I think David grieves over the loss of relationship with Saul and grieves over being completely misunderstood. Have you ever lost a friend or maybe a relative or a relationship over a misunderstanding? David knew that God understood, but he still grieved for Saul. And we can grieve over lost relationships where there is a misunderstanding. When Saul was finally killed in battle, rather than rejoicing that his enemy was now gone, David grieved over the loss of Saul. He says to save me from the men of bloodshed. Again, these are men who are defined by their willingness to kill. This is probably not the first time they've been asked by Saul to do something like this. They are not coming to arrest David, but to kill him. They have set an ambush for him. And they have done this because there is no guilt in David's life. There's no reason for this to happen. If David had tried to take the crown by force or instigated a rebellion or had done harm to Saul, maybe they would be justified. But he hasn't, nor will he the remainder of Saul's life. He has loved Saul. He has protected Saul. He has served Saul. And in that, David kept his innocence. When someone does you wrong, don't lose your innocence. Don't let go of your innocence. When someone rises up against you to do you harm, do two things. Pray for them and seek God. In verse 4, David says this, For no guilt of mine they run and set themselves against me. Arouse thyself to help me and see. And then verse 5, he uses the word awake. Arouse and awake. It's as if God is not hearing. God is sleeping. And David at this moment wonders if God really knows what's going on. Either God knows and can't do anything about it, he knows and won't do anything about it, or he doesn't know. God, in David's point, seems to be sleeping. David seems to be forgotten. David also questions if God sees the evil that is happening all around the nations, not just in his own life. Well, look at what's happening all around. And you and I can look at what's happening in this world and go, God, where are you? Or look at your own life and maybe it's a circumstance or situation and say, God, where are you? Don't you care that I've lost a job, or that I have an illness, or have lost a relationship? Please, God, wake up. God, arouse yourself and see. Have you ever asked God to do that? So David first prays, and he asks God to do something on his behalf. And then he prays, and he tells God what he is going to do on God's behalf. And he's going to do two things, or based on two things. In verse 5, he describes God in these words. He says, Thou, O Lord God of hosts, the God of Israel. What David is going to do is based on what God has done. What has God done? He is the Lord of hosts. He is the God of Israel. He is Yahweh, God of armies, God of Israel. David knows God has acted in the past on a large scale for the entire nation. He brought them out of Egypt into the promised land. God was victorious. God has acted in the past, and he will act in the present. God has Israel's best interest at heart. If the best interest is to deliver David, David will be delivered. God is and will be victorious. If his best interest is in your deliverance or my deliverance, he will do that. And David, as he looks at what God's deliverance, where it rests, is in what God has done in the past, and then who God is. Verse 9 and 10 says this, Because of his strength I will watch for you, for God is my stronghold. My God in his loving kindness will meet me. God will let me look triumphantly upon my foes. David is not alone in his struggle. He has the name of God, the work of God, and the presence of God surrounding him. David knows that God's might is greater than the number of enemies Saul can throw against him. They need to fear, not David. But David knows God in his loving kindness. Saul had known God in his fear. That's how God will meet David, in his loving kindness. That's an amazing verse. God will meet him in his loving kindness. God will meet David's enemies with might and power, but will meet David in his love. That thought is reassuring to me, that God meets me, not in his might, where I would be overwhelmed at his power, fearful of who he is, fearful of what I deserve. But he meets me, and he meets David in his love that is demonstrated, assured, and offered to me through his Son, Jesus. And in that love, I'm forgiven. In that love, I am desired. In that love, I am purchased. Not because I've earned it, but because God gives it. And that's his grace. So because of those two things, what God has done and who God is, David says he will do one thing. He will watch. Verse 9, because of his strength, I will watch for thee. He will not get his sling out. He will not build a defense perimeter around his house. He will watch. And that can be the hardest thing to do when you are a person of action like David. He isn't watching what is going to happen to his enemies. He is watching and waiting for God to see how and when God will show up. So David prays those two things, asking God to act on his behalf. And then he prays and says, God, this is what I am going to do, and I'm going to watch. I am going to wait. I'm going to hope, and I'm going to trust in you. The last part of the psalm is, to me, what really speaks to my heart. The song. He prays, and then he sings. And the song comes from his heart. His focus turns from his enemies to what he knows, from his enemies to what he knows to be true. After describing his enemies and their sinfulness, he mentions one more thing he will do. He will sing. Verse 16, but as for me, I shall sing of thy strength. He will sing of God's strength. He will sing joyfully of God's loving kindness. He will sing in the morning. That's when his enemies were planning on coming. He will sing praises. He's not waiting to sing until all things are resolved and his enemies are defeated. He will sing now in the time of distress, because God has been and is those things in his life. I don't find it easy to sing in times of distress. When I seem to be forsaken, when I don't know the outcome, maybe I can pray like David for God to act against my enemies and for my circumstances to change. But to sing without seeing God's action, that's hard. A few years ago, I was working at a church about 30 minutes from home. And as I would drive home, I would often listen to the radio. And this one particular day, as I'm listening to the radio, I heard a bulletin come across the radio. And there had been an industrial accident in Heartland. And I don't know if I've ever heard this before, but they gave the name of an individual who had been severely hurt, and that there was flight for life coming to this business. Well, I realized I knew this person. He and his wife were good friends of ours. And arriving home and informing my wife, we got in the car and we went immediately to Froedtert Hospital. We weren't able to see him as he was in intensive care, just hanging on to life. But we prayed with his wife. They said this was a machine shop, and he was helping somebody, and he owned it, and he was helping an operator with a machine, and he did what he knew he shouldn't have done. He had baggy clothes on, and as he bent over, his clothes got caught in the machine, and as it tightened around his neck was broken, and he couldn't breathe. he was just hanging on to life by a thread. I went to see him, I don't know if it was 2, 3, or 4 weeks later, because his recovery was so slow. And as I went up to his room, he wasn't there. So I went back down to the parking garage, got in my car to go home, and as I'm pulling out of the parking garage, I'm looking both right and left, I see him. He's sitting in a wheelchair outside a freighter by the main door. So I quickly drove around the circle and parked in a no parking zone and got out of my car, and I went up to him. And I greeted him, and I hugged him. And as we talked just briefly, and it was really hard because he could not talk like that. And we talked briefly, and I told him, I said, you need to sing. Well, he had been part of a worship team that my wife had led. And he, in that voice, told me, he said, they told me that I need to sing because singing will help me. And his life, though he never recovered, he never got out of a wheelchair. He could hardly talk the rest of his days. But his life became a song. The last time I saw him, we went to see him, and he wanted to show us the new souped-up wheelchair that he had gotten. And when we got there, he was in his wheelchair, and he said, watch. And as we watched, he took off on that wheelchair like, I've never seen a wheelchair go that fast. And that was his life. He wasn't forgotten, even in the midst of that challenging, difficult life situation. When David seemed forgotten, he sang of God's goodness, strength, loving kindness. And in that song, he was reminded that he was not forsaken. And at that moment, David's life was a song. As a kid sitting on the church front step, there was nothing I could do. About 30 minutes later, a car shows up, and out pops the adult leader. He was so apologetic. But I was so happy he came back, that I wasn't forgotten. As a young man arriving at seminary, I went back to the school on Monday and found a housing board. And I saw on that board an opening at a house needing one more male roommate. Calling, I made an appointment, and I met the owner and looked at the room. It wasn't much, but it had a bed, a bunk bed, and I shared the room with another person. But the best of all, it was only $50 a month. And for 2 years, that became my home. I'm still in contact with one of the roommates to this day. God didn't forsake me. Recently, I've been dealing with some personal issues that have been hard. And and I've wondered, a couple weeks ago, I kind of got to a point where I just said, God, where are you? And often when life is hard, I get on my bike. And I biked around Lac La Belle in Oconomowoc. And at the end, there's a place with a couple benches where you can sit. And one has a swing. And that's one of my favorite places to sit and watch out over the lake. And that's what I was doing. But I was asking God, where are you? And as the sun was setting, and as I was sitting there, a beam of light from the reflection of the sun came right to me. You know what's interesting? Have you ever sat on a lake as the sun is setting and seen that reflection of the sun? And if I was sitting 100 yards up the lake where there's another bench, that beam, that reflection would come right towards me. And as I thought about that, it struck me all of a sudden. That's as if God were saying, Roger, wherever you are, my reflection, my son Jesus, is there looking right at you. The hard part is, when it's cloudy. And you can't see that reflection. But to know and understand and believe that God's reflection is looking right at me. David had that same experience. In the midst of his enemies wanting to kill him, and David praying for God to deliver him. And then David acknowledging what God has done in the past in his life and in the nation of Israel, and who God is, that God is loving kindness. And then he sings this song. That reflection of who God is real in his life. If you're struggling, if you have any times of distress, whether you're in one now or you will, we all do, look for that reflection and trust God in the midst of it. And this week, if you have some circumstance that's challenging, sing. Now you may not, like me, want to sing out loud, but you can sing in your heart. And you can thank God for his loving kindness.